roast.
Lance Armstrong right now getting roasted after the fact that the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency is going to continue its pursuit of him. He's not going to fight those charges, and so that means he's going to be stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles, an Olympic medal, and he'll be given a lifetime cycling ban. To give us more perspective on what this means, we're bringing in Bicycling Magazine editor-in-chief Peter Flax, joining us on the Subway Fresh Takes hotline. Peter, you've been writing about cycling since 1999, been the editor-in-chief of the magazine since 2010, and Lance has had a relationship with this magazine since he was a junior in the early 90s, so you know him well. What's your reaction to the fact that a guy who has so vehemently fought all the charges against him is now giving up the fight?
Well, I think he's in damage control mode, and you know, I think it was a smart move to, you know, take the least worst decision in front of him, and I think this gives him, you know, a chance to get some moral high ground, you know, to just portray himself as a victim. But I think he knows that if he had gone forward in arbitration, he would have lost, and it would have done even more damage than what he decided to do last night.
What is his? We're getting a lot of reaction of people outside the world of cycling that are just looking at him as a good guy and doing the work with cancer and not really knowing a lot about cycling. What is the perception and the thought of Lance Armstrong within the cycling community?
I think it's really split. You know, there's a huge contingent of people that see him as a great champion, as someone who overcame cancer and then took his fame and fortune and created a foundation and inspired millions of people, and all those things are true. And then there are a lot of cyclists that look at him as someone who not only cheated and used performance-enhancing drugs like so many athletes did in that era, but that he denied it in a way that rang false to them. And so people are split. I think, you know, there's no justice here, and no one's going to walk away from this decision feeling happy.
Yeah, speaking of people being split, even the agencies, International Cycling Union, saying it'll wait for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency to explain why Lance Armstrong should lose his 7 Tour de France titles. Sports governing body says it wants USADA to submit to the parties concerned a reasoned decision explaining the action taken. And for those that are not necessarily Lance Armstrong apologists, but defenders of him, Peter, they'll point to the fact he's taken over 500 drug tests, which Armstrong has always pointed out and never failed. So what exactly was all this overwhelming evidence they had against him?
Well, you know, I think at the center of the case are about 10 former teammates that for preferential treatment or immunity testified to USADA, and a lot of them are people that are his most trusted lieutenants, people that have never testified against him, and a few of their testimonies would have been extremely damaging if and when they're made public, that people admitting what performance-enhancing drugs they used and what they witnessed within the team and saw Lance do, and it would have put Lance in a difficult corner where the people that have defended him for so many years are finally opening up with what really happened in that era.
Peter, what do you think about Lance?
I think he's the greatest bike racer that I ever saw. I think he's a great champion, and I think, you know, as a fan of professional sports in general, you know, you get a little used to just reading about athletes who you know, cheated to gain fame and fortune. But I can't think of another athlete that used that fame and fortune to do something as remarkable as what Lance did, and the way he has given inspiration and hope to millions of people. So it's a really painful moment for me, because I'm absolutely convinced that he did dope, but I'm also convinced that he's the greatest racer of his generation and should be a hero to people.
Talking about Bicycling Magazine editor-in-chief Peter Flax, who's been writing about cycling since 1999 and has been editor-in-chief of that magazine since 2010. You mentioned you're conflicted, Peter. I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. And for those that are desirous of seeing the entire sport cleaned up, how dirty is the sport of cycling?
Well, you know, the sport is a lot cleaner than it was in Lance Armstrong's era. They have much more careful testing than they did, and obviously they can time how fast the athletes climb these giant mountain passes, and the top professional cyclists are actually going a little bit slower than they were in Lance's era, and that would be like suddenly 10 years from now, linemen in the NFL, you know, being 20 pounds lighter and running the 40.2 seconds slower. It's you know, really clear evidence that the sport is cleaner. I don't actually think cycling is any dirtier than any other professional sport, but the way in which the sport has tried to be transparent has not gone well, to say the least, where, you know, people on the outside look in and just think that, you know, the whole thing's a circus.
What do you say to those that are saying to Lance, you've been fighting this for so long, why stop fighting now? Why don't you continue to fight if you truly think you're innocent?
Yeah, I mean, we have a story in Bicycling this month called "Injustice for All," and there is no justice. It's true that he's a victim of a witch hunt, and it's also true that he's guilty as charged. And so I think it's his legacy as it's being shaped right now is really difficult to get a hold of. I think he down because he knew he would lose, and now he's in a place to try and save his foundation, his reputation. He's going to be accurately able to portray himself as someone who USADA was trying to railroad.
Peter Flax, the editor-in-chief of Bicycling Magazine. Really appreciate your perspective this morning.
Good to talk to you.
Well, he makes that point, Mike, that he himself is very conflicted, that he is the greatest athlete he saw in his profession, but by the same token, he is convinced that Lance Armstrong was cheating.
Yeah, it's still the majority. And that's, I guess, the difference we're going to get is people within the cycling world and people on the outside who only watched the Tour de France because Lance Armstrong was in it. Mm-hmm. And he was cycling. They weren't watching cycling. They were watching Lance Armstrong because he was in it. I think the majority of people out there couldn't tell you another race in cycling, quite honestly, but they look at Lance Armstrong and just say, wow, look at the story. And I think that's why in our poll, and there'll be tons of poll questions out there, that 84% of the people are saying it's not affecting the positive thought they have of Lance Armstrong. They're saying, he's a good guy. He passed all the tests. He's done a lot of good work raising all this money, and so he's good in our book.
Also got a tweet here, live strong, more like live wrong. Some people taking cheap shots at Lance Armstrong perhaps, or maybe just looking at what they feel is the case against a guy who cheated the country, or at least cheated his sport, and giving